the smell hits you like a physical blow. It mingles with the frankincense burning in silver censers, creating a nauseating cocktail of sanctity and decay. You set down the basin and approach carefully, knowing that to interrupt her devotions could mean imprisonment or worse. But as you draw closer, you notice something that makes your blood run cold. Tiny dark specks move across the stained fabric. Fleas, dozens of them, living and breeding in the folds of her unwashed garments. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The story you've just entered is not entirely true, but it's not entirely false either. For centuries, a persistent myth has clung to the memory of Isabella I of Castile, the fierce queen who united Spain and funded Christopher Columbus's voyage to the New World. According to this legend, Isabella took a sacred vow never to change her underwear until Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, fell to Christian forces. The siege lasted 8 months, and supposedly, so did her unwashed undergarments. Some versions of this tale claim she wore the same shift for 10 years. Others insist it was a different Spanish queen entirely, perhaps one of the later Habsburg monarchs, known for their religious extremism and physical peculiarities. The details shift like sand in the wind, but the core image remains: a powerful woman driven by fanatical piety, living in filth that would make a peasant recoil. Modern historians largely dismiss this story as propaganda, a way to either sanctify Isabella as a martyr for the faith or vilify her as a religious extremist, depending on the teller's agenda. But the fact that such a story could emerge, spread, and persist for over 5 centuries tells us something profound about the world Isabella inhabited, a world where the line between holiness and horror was often impossibly thin. To understand why this myth feels so believable, we must descend into the medieval mind and examine the strange relationship between dirt, divinity, and power in late 15th century Spain. We must explore a civilization where bathing was considered not just unnecessary, but actively dangerous, where undergarments were magical talismans, and where the most powerful people on earth lived in conditions that would horrify a modern homeless shelter. The Spain of Isabella's time was a land caught between worlds. Christian kingdoms had spent 7 centuries slowly pushing Muslim rulers south, a process called the Reconquista that would finally end with Isabella's conquest of Granada in 1492 AD. This was not just a military campaign, but a cultural collision that shaped every aspect of daily life, including the most intimate details of personal hygiene. In the Islamic kingdoms of Al-Andalus, bathing was both a religious obligation and a social ritual. Public bathhouses, called hammams, dotted every major city. Muslims washed 5 times daily before prayers, and the Quran explicitly praised cleanliness as half of faith. These bathhouses were architectural marvels, domed chambers filled with heated pools, where men and women at separate times would spend hours soaking, scrubbing, and socializing. The water was channeled through ingenious systems of pipes and aqueducts, many dating back to Roman times. But in the Christian kingdoms that would become Spain, bathing carried a terrible stigma. Church authorities viewed public baths as dens of sin, places where naked bodies mingled in steamy darkness, where the boundaries between male and female, noble and commoner, dissolved in the democratic embrace of hot water. Worse still, bathing was associated with Islam, Judaism, and paganism, all enemies of the true faith. Saint Jerome, one of the early church fathers, had declared that he who has bathed in Christ has no need of a second bath. This became the theological foundation for centuries of Christian uncleanliness. To wash the body was to wash away the protection of baptism, to invite demons into pores left vulnerable by soap and water. The truly holy, it was believed, should smell like martyrs of blood, sweat, and sacred suffering. Isabella grew up in this world of sanctified filth. Born in 1451 AD in the town of Madrigal de las Altas Torres, she was the daughter of John II of Castile and Isabella of Portugal. Her childhood was marked by civil war, political intrigue, and the constant threat of assassination. In such an environment, personal hygiene ranked far below personal survival. The royal court of her youth was a mobile city of thousands: nobles, servants, guards, horses, and dogs, all traveling together in a vast caravan that moved from castle to castle, consuming local resources before moving on like a swarm of locusts. Imagine the smell of such a gathering: unwashed bodies pressed together in great halls, chamber pots overflowing with waste, rotting food scraps thrown to packs of feral dogs, horses relieving themselves wherever they stood. In the winter of 1468 AD, when Isabella was just 17, she witnessed something that would shape her understanding of cleanliness forever. An outbreak of plague struck the court while it was staying at the Alcazar of Segovia. The disease known then as the Black Death had been ravaging Europe for over a century, killing roughly 1/3 of the population each time it struck. The plague began, as it always did, with the rats. They emerged from the walls in broad daylight, stumbling and falling, their fur matted with blood and pus. Then came the fleas, clouds of them, desperately seeking new hosts as their rodent carriers died. Within days, the first humans began to show symptoms: fever, chills, and the characteristic buboes, swollen lymph nodes that could grow as large as apples, filled with black blood and corruption. Isabella watched as her own servants fell ill, their bodies covered in dark spots that gave the plague its name. She saw strong men reduced to whimpering children, calling for their mothers as they died in pools of their own waste. The court physicians, dressed in their bizarre beak-like masks filled with aromatic herbs, were helpless against the disease. They prescribed bleeding, purging, and prayer, but death came regardless. What struck Isabella most powerfully was how the plague seemed to spare the dirtiest members of the court. The kitchen servants, who were covered in grease and food scraps, remained healthy. The stable boys, who slept with the horses and never bathed, showed no signs of illness. But the nobles, who occasionally washed their hands and faces, died in alarming numbers. This observation, though based on coincidence rather than causation, would reinforce Isabella's growing belief that cleanliness was not just unnecessary, but potentially dangerous. The truly faithful, she concluded, should trust in God's protection rather than worldly remedies like soap and water. The religious context of Isabel's time made this logic seem not just reasonable, but divinely inspired. The late 15th century was an era of intense mysticism in Spanish Christianity. Saints like Catherine of Siena and Francis of Assisi were celebrated for their deliberate embrace of filth and degradation. Catherine reportedly drank pus from the wounds of plague victims, while Francis never washed his hands after touching lepers. These saints were not mentally ill, as modern observers might assume. They were following a sophisticated theological tradition that viewed the body as a prison for the soul, a source of temptation and sin that must be mortified and suppressed. To care for the body, to wash it, perfume it, or adorn it, was to commit the sin of vanity, to place physical comfort above spiritual salvation. This philosophy reached its extreme form in the practice of self-flagellation, which Isabella embraced with terrifying enthusiasm. 3 times weekly, she would lock herself in her private chapel and strip to the waist. Using a whip made of knotted cords, she would beat her back and shoulders until blood ran down her skin, mixing with the accumulated dirt and sweat of weeks without bathing. The physical pain was only part of the ritual. The psychological effect was equally important. By making her body a source of agony rather than pleasure, Isabella believed she was drawing closer to Christ, who had suffered on the cross for humanity's sins. The blood that dried on her skin was not just evidence of her devotion, but a protective barrier against temptation and sin. Her undergarments, the linen shifts that lay closest to her skin, became repositories of this sanctified suffering. They absorbed not just her blood but her sweat, her tears, and the various oils and secretions of her unwashed body. Over time, these garments took on an almost mystical significance in Isabella's mind. They were not just clothing but relics, physical manifestations of her spiritual journey. The specific myth about Isabella's underwear vow relates to the Siege of Granada, which began in April 1491 AD. This was to be the final battle of the Reconquista, the ultimate test of Christian faith against Islamic resistance. As Isabella prepared for what she knew would be a lengthy campaign, she reportedly made a vow before the altar of the cathedral in Córdoba. She would not change her linen shift until Granada fell to Christian forces. Whether this vow was actually made is impossible to verify, but it reflects the mindset of the time. Medieval and Renaissance Christians frequently made such bargains with God, promising to endure specific hardships in exchange for divine favor. These vows were considered binding contracts, enforceable by the threat of eternal damnation. The siege itself was a masterpiece of medieval warfare. Rather than attempting to storm Granada's massive walls, Isabella and her husband Ferdinand chose to starve the city into submission. They built a new city called Santa Fe, just outside Granada's walls, complete with churches, markets, and administrative buildings. From this base, they slowly tightened the noose around the Muslim stronghold. For 8 months, Isabella lived in Santa Fe, directing the siege and maintaining the morale of her troops. If she had indeed made a vow not to change her undergarments, The physical and psychological toll would have been immense. The Spanish spring and summer were brutally hot, with temperatures reaching over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick with dust, smoke from cooking fires, and the smell of thousands of unwashed soldiers. Contemporary accounts describe Isabella during this period as increasingly gaunt and hollow-eyed, her face marked by an otherworldly intensity. She spent most of her time in prayer, often standing for hours before a portable altar in her tent. Visitors reported that she seemed to emanate a strange odor, not entirely unpleasant, but distinctly organic, like old leather mixed with dried flowers. The fleas that supposedly infested her clothing would have been more than just a nuisance. In the medieval understanding of disease, fleas were not just pests, but potential vectors of supernatural corruption. They were associated with the devil, who was often depicted as a flea-bitten creature emerging from the bowels of hell. To harbor fleas was to invite demonic influence, yet Isabella seemed to welcome them as instruments of divine testing. The psychological effects of prolonged unwashing went beyond mere discomfort. Medieval physicians, following ancient Greek theories, believed that the body's natural oils and secretions were essential for maintaining the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To wash these substances away was to invite illness and madness. Isabella's behavior during the siege of Granada suggests she may have been experiencing what modern psychiatrists would recognize as a form of religious psychosis. She reported frequent visions of saints and angels, claimed to hear divine voices directing her military strategy, and became increasingly paranoid about the loyalty of her advisors. Her refusal to change her undergarments may have been both a cause and a symptom of this mental state. The broader context of Spanish society made Isabella's alleged behavior seem not just acceptable but admirable. Throughout the Iberian Peninsula, stories circulated of holy women who had achieved sainthood through deliberate self-degradation. Maria de Santo Domingo, a contemporary of Isabella, reportedly never washed her hands for 30 years, claiming that cleanliness was a sign of spiritual weakness. Another mystic, Catalina de Cardona, was said to have worn the same hair shirt for 40 years until it became so encrusted with blood and dirt that it could stand upright on its own. These were not isolated cases but part of a broader cultural movement that equated physical suffering with spiritual advancement. The Spanish Inquisition, established by Isabella herself in 1478 AD, actively promoted this ideology as a way to identify true Christians. Those who bathed regularly, changed their clothes frequently, or showed other signs of concern for bodily comfort were suspected of being crypto-Muslims or crypto-Jews, secretly practicing the cleanliness rituals of their ancestral faiths. The medical understanding of the time provided intellectual justification for this systematic neglect of hygiene. Physicians believed that the skin was a porous barrier that could be weakened by excessive washing. They taught that certain beneficial vapors, including those produced by unwashed bodies, could protect against disease, while the cold air that entered through clean pores could cause illness. This theory was reinforced by practical observation. In an era before germ theory, when soap was made from lye and wood ash, excessive washing often did cause skin irritation and infection. The wealthy, who could afford to bathe regularly, often suffered from skin diseases that were rare among the unwashed poor. This created a feedback loop that reinforced the association between cleanliness and illness. The specific focus on undergarments in the Isabella myth reflects the medieval understanding of linen as a magical substance. Unlike wool or silk, which were derived from animals, linen was made from flax plants and was considered pure and holy. It was the fabric of angels, the material from which burial shrouds were made. To wear linen next to the skin was to create a protective barrier against evil influences. But this protective power was believed to increase with time and use. Fresh linen was considered spiritually neutral, but linen that had absorbed the wearer's sweat, blood, and other bodily fluids became charged with their life force. The longer such garments were worn, the more powerful they became. This belief explains why medieval saints often wore the same linen shifts for decades, treating them as holy relics. Isabella's court was filled with such relics, clothing, prayer beads, and other objects that had been worn or touched by holy figures. These items were believed to have healing powers, and people would travel hundreds of miles to kiss them or rub them against their sick bodies. If Isabella had indeed worn the same shift for months during the siege of Granada, it would have been considered one of the most powerful relics in Christendom. The psychological impact of wearing increasingly filthy undergarments would have been complex and profound. On one level, it would have been a constant reminder of Isabella's spiritual commitment, a physical manifestation of her willingness to suffer for her faith. Every moment of discomfort, every itch and irritation, would have been transformed into a prayer, a small offering to God. But the isolation imposed by extreme uncleanliness would have been equally significant. As Isabella's personal hygiene deteriorated, she would have become increasingly cut off from normal human contact. Only the most devoted servants would have been willing to attend her closely, and even they would have struggled to hide their revulsion. This isolation would have intensified her already strong tendency toward mysticism and paranoia. The fleas that allegedly infested her clothing would have added another layer of psychological torment. Medieval people believed that fleas were miniature demons, sent by Satan to torment the faithful. Each bite would have been interpreted as a spiritual test, a battle between good and evil fought on the battlefield of Isabella's body. The fact that she endured this torment without complaint would have been seen as evidence of her sanctity. The broader implications of Isabella's alleged behavior extended far beyond her personal spiritual journey. As queen of the most powerful nation in Europe, her actions and appearance set standards for the entire Spanish court. If she refused to change her undergarments, it became fashionable, or at least acceptable, for her nobles to follow suit. Contemporary accounts from foreign ambassadors describe the Spanish court as uniquely malodorous, even by medieval standards. The Venetian ambassador Pietro Martir d'Anghiera wrote in 1491 AD that approaching the Spanish royal presence required great fortitude of spirit and strong stomach, while the French envoy Philippe de Comines noted that Spanish nobles seemed to wear their unwashed state as a badge of honor. This cultural acceptance of extreme uncleanliness had practical consequences that extended far beyond matters of personal comfort. The Spanish court became a breeding ground for diseases that were rare in other European kingdoms. Skin conditions, intestinal parasites, and respiratory infections flourished in an environment where basic hygiene was actively discouraged. The fleas that supposedly lived in Isabella's clothing were not just a personal affliction, but a potential threat to public health. Medieval fleas were vectors for bubonic plague, and a single infested individual could trigger an epidemic that might kill thousands. The fact that Isabella survived her alleged ordeal may have been due to luck, divine intervention, or simply the biological reality that some people have natural resistance to flea-borne diseases. The siege of Granada finally ended on January when the Muslim leader Boabdil surrendered the city to Isabella and Ferdinand. According to the myth, this was the moment when Isabella finally changed her undergarments after 8 months of continuous wear. The garments she removed were supposedly so stiff with accumulated filth that they could stand upright without support, like a suit of armor made from human secretions. Whether this detail is true or not, the fall of Granada did mark a turning point in Isabella's life and reign. With the Reconquista complete, she could turn her attention to other matters, including the support of Christopher Columbus's voyage to the New World, which would depart just 8 months later. The same religious fervor that supposedly drove her to wear unwashed undergarments would soon drive her to spread Christianity to the Americas, with consequences that would reshape the entire world. The myth of Isabella's underwear vow also reflects the complex relationship between power and purity in medieval society. For a queen to deliberately degrade herself through extreme uncleanliness was paradoxically a demonstration of her ultimate authority. Only someone with absolute power could afford to appear so powerless. Only someone whose position was unassailable could risk such vulnerability. This dynamic is visible in many aspects of medieval royal behavior. Kings and queens would sometimes dress as peasants, serve food to the poor, or perform other acts of deliberate humiliation, but always in carefully controlled circumstances that ultimately reinforced their authority. Isabella's alleged refusal to change her undergarments fits this pattern perfectly, a public demonstration of private devotion that served to elevate her spiritual status, even as it degraded her physical condition. The gendered aspects of this myth are equally significant. In medieval society, women's bodies were seen as inherently dirty and dangerous, sources of temptation and sin, that required constant vigilance and control. For a woman to embrace this dirtiness deliberately was to take ownership of her supposed corruption, to transform it from a source of shame into a source of power. Isabella's extreme uncleanliness also served to desexualize her in a way that was crucial for her political survival. As a female ruler in a male-dominated world, she needed to distance herself from traditional feminine roles and expectations. By making her body repulsive through neglect, she created a protective barrier that allowed her to function as a political leader without being reduced to a sexual object. The practical realities of medieval undergarments make the Isabella myth even more disturbing when examined in detail. The linen shifts worn by wealthy women in the 15th century were not simple garments but complex constructions designed to shape and support the body. They were typically made from multiple layers of fabric, with intricate seams and fastenings that would have trapped moisture, bacteria, and parasites. After weeks or months of continuous wear, such garments would have become breeding grounds for a variety of microorganisms. The warm, moist environment created by unwashed linen would have supported the growth of bacteria, fungi, and other pathogens. The itching and burning sensations caused by these organisms would have been interpreted by Isabella as spiritual trials, evidence of her growing closeness to God. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Isabella to endure such conditions are similar to those observed in modern cases of extreme religious devotion. The human mind has a remarkable capacity to reframe suffering as meaningful, to transform pain into purpose. Isabella's alleged refusal to change her undergarments was not simple masochism, but a sophisticated form of psychological conditioning that allowed her to derive spiritual satisfaction from physical discomfort. The broader European context of the late 15th century helps explain why such extreme behavior was not just tolerated but celebrated. This was an era of intense religious and political upheaval, when traditional certainties were being challenged by new discoveries and ideas. The Protestant Reformation was still decades away, but the Catholic Church was already struggling to maintain its authority in the face of growing criticism and corruption. In this environment, figures like Isabella, who demonstrated extreme devotion to the faith, were seen as beacons of hope, proof that true Christianity could still flourish despite the challenges of the modern world. Her alleged willingness to sacrifice her physical comfort for spiritual advancement made her a powerful symbol of religious authenticity, a living saint who could inspire others to greater devotion. The technological limitations of the time also made Isabella's alleged behavior more understandable. In an era before modern plumbing, soap, or understanding of bacteria, maintaining personal hygiene was a constant struggle even for the wealthy. The difference between clean and dirty was often a matter of degree rather than kind, and someone who chose to embrace extreme uncleanliness was simply taking a natural tendency to its logical conclusion. The preservation of Isabella's reputation despite these allegations speaks to the complex ways in which historical memory is constructed and maintained. Rather than being remembered as a madwoman or a fanatic, she is generally celebrated as one of Spain's greatest monarchs, the queen who united the country and launched its golden age. The myth of her unwashed undergarments has become a footnote to her story rather than its central theme. This selective memory reflects the ongoing power of the Spanish monarchy and Catholic Church to shape historical narratives. Stories that might damage Isabella's reputation are downplayed or dismissed, while those that enhance her spiritual authority are preserved and celebrated. The result is a sanitized version of history that obscures the stranger and more disturbing aspects of medieval life. The medical consequences of Isabella's alleged behavior would have extended far beyond personal discomfort. Prolonged wearing of unwashed undergarments can cause serious skin infections, urinary tract problems, and other health issues that could have affected her ability to rule effectively. Some historians have suggested that her reported mental instability during the later years of her reign may have been connected to infections caused by poor hygiene. The social implications of the Isabella myth extend into the present day. In many parts of the world, extreme religious devotion is still expressed through deliberate self-neglect and physical suffering. The same psychological mechanisms that supposedly drove Isabella to wear unwashed undergarments for months continue to motivate modern ascetics and mystics who view bodily comfort as an obstacle to spiritual advancement. The enduring power of this myth also reflects our continued fascination with the intersection of power, religion, and sexuality. The image of a powerful queen living in self-imposed filth touches on deep cultural anxieties about female authority, religious extremism, and the relationship between public and private life. It reminds us that even the most powerful people are subject to the same biological realities as everyone else, that beneath the pageantry of royal life lies the same messy, uncomfortable, mortal flesh that we all inhabit. The question of whether Isabella actually made and kept her alleged vow may be less important than what the myth reveals about the world she inhabited. In a society where extreme religious devotion was valued above personal comfort, where uncleanliness was seen as a sign of spiritual purity, and where the most powerful woman in Europe could be celebrated for wearing the same undergarments for months, the line between sanctity and insanity had become dangerously thin. As dawn breaks over the Alhambra in Granada, 5 centuries after Isabella's supposed triumph, the morning light reveals a city transformed. The fountains that once fed the Islamic baths now water Christian gardens. The geometric patterns that once adorned the walls have been replaced by crosses and saints. The call to prayer that once echoed from minarets has been silenced forever, replaced by the tolling of church bells. But in the shadows of the ancient palaces, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the whisper of fabric against skin, the scratch of fingernails against linen, the soft prayer of a queen who believed that salvation could be found in the most intimate forms of suffering. The myth of Isabella's underwear may be false, but the world that created it, a world where divine and human, sacred and profane, pure and corrupted existed in constant, uncomfortable proximity, was all too real. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this story is not whether Isabella actually wore the same undergarments for months, but that we live in a world where such behavior could be seen as not just acceptable, but holy. The fleas that supposedly infested her clothing have long since died, but the ideas that allowed them to flourish, the belief that physical suffering leads to spiritual advancement, that cleanliness is a form of vanity, that the body is an enemy to be conquered rather than a temple to be honored, continue to shape our world in ways both subtle and profound. The queen, who may never have changed her underwear, reminds us that history is not just a collection of dates and battles, but a record of human choices, human beliefs, and human bodies living and dying in conditions that would be unimaginable to us today. Her story, whether true or false, opens a window into a world where the most powerful woman in Europe could be celebrated for embracing the very conditions that would horrify us today, and where the line between devotion and degradation was drawn not by reason or comfort, but by faith alone,